Hello everyone, we're back with part 2 of how to play the opening without knowing the opening. And the first thing that needs to be repeated is that chess is a relative skill-based game, which means you could violate every one of the 7 opening principles if you're better than your opponent, and maybe even if you're equal to your opponent. Remember what Tony Miles did to Karpov when Karpov played e4? Tony Miles played a6 and actually went on to win the game. I mean, that's amazing. And even if you have a slight strategic advantage, it's very difficult to drive it home for the win. And even Carlsen recently played to e4 as black. He played knight to f6. His opponent played e5, and he went back. This was a blitz game, but he did go on to win that game. But these players are very well schooled in the principles and in the elements of chess, time, space, force, and pawn structure, and they know what they need to do to regain the balance. So let's continue our schooling and gain a deeper understanding of each of the opening pawn moves. In the first lesson, we looked at d4 and the c5 gambit. We looked at the pros and cons of capturing, of pushing forward, of defending the pawn. But there's one more thing worth noting that I didn't mention in that first video. If white captures, it opens the c file for black, which is a common entryway into enemy territory. By far the most common opening moves you will encounter are pawn to e4 and e5 or c5 and d4 and d5 or knight to f6 as a second move for black. So later we will be looking at these common openings, but for now let's continue with first move gambits or engagements that pawns can make against your pawns. And after that, we'll look at second move gambits, like pawn to c4, followed by pawn to e5, for example. We'll even look at what you should do if your opponent plays really oddball and off-the-wall openings. Let's say you play e4 and he plays h6. What should you do? How should you proceed? Now let's look at the other gambit on the d-pawn, the only other gambit available on the first move, and that is if black plays e5. The database shows that this has only been tried 72 times by black, compared to 6,500 times for the c5 push, and 143,000 times for d5, and 360,000 times for knight to f6. Bear in mind that at the professional level, black is fairly content with drawing, so they look for openings that have a high draw percentage for black. Since most of the win percentages are fairly equal, surprisingly, at a pretty low level, like at around 20 to 25% win ratio for black. And black tends to avoid openings that give white more than a 40% win possibility, usually around 35%, which is what most of the standard replies to d4 or e4 provide, which we'll also be looking at later. e5 doesn't give any of the advantages that c5 can offer to black. If white just captures the pawn, it'll take black some moves to regain it, whereas with c5 the queen could just pick it off with a check on the second move. Not only that, but if white captures the pawn, it also prevents the knight from coming to its ideal square until this pawn is captured. Also, black is just offering his e-pawn for the d-pawn instead of a c-pawn for the d-pawn. So overall it doesn't have any of the pluses that c5 has for black. Also, black won't get the same developmental advantage which gambits usually provide. What's interesting, though, is that white doesn't usually capture the pawn in the games that I looked at here. He prefers to play e4, but surprisingly that gives black a much higher win ratio. There are many more games played with this scenario here because white can actually create that on his second move if black plays the standard e5 move against e4. For example, if we start with e4 and black plays e5, white can actually initiate this, which gives black the capture tempo by taking, and then the queen comes out, and white doesn't do as well. Now let's look at e4 and the two gambits that can happen against the e4 pawn. e4, and black can play d5. This is a very common opening. So what should white do? Let's look at our possibilities. If we play e5, we move the same piece twice, but we have kept the knight from coming to f6. But there's a big difference. We haven't gained a pawn in the process as we did with the other maneuver here with d takes e5. So the compensation isn't quite as justified here. Advancing the pawn also solidifies this d5 pawn. Black will have two pawns to replace it if we try to challenge it. So releasing the engagement here isn't as justified as it was with this other scenario with the d4 pawn when we pushed to d5. That was in the first video on how to play the opening without knowing the opening for those of you who are just watching this video. And Black can develop a very strong center by playing c5 now, greatly reducing White's options for challenging the center. If he plays c4, he can play d4. We can still challenge the d4 square with c3 or maybe with d4 right away, but White is really playing catch-up in this scenario because he gave up this extra move. So if we don't pass the pawn here, and if we try to defend with the knight, they can just push here, chase the knight away. If we try to defend this way, capture, capture, and he could take our queen and we can't castle. Moving the f pawn just sucks because we can't bring our knight out. It opens up avenues to our king. We could ignore it and play d4. But I hate this move just on the grounds of him capturing this pawn here. We can't bring our knight out to its ideal square. And we're playing catch-up, trying to recapture the pawn. In a sense, we've offered our opponent a gambit pawn. He also has other options. He doesn't have to capture the pawn. He can play c6 or e6. We're just giving him way too many options. These are playable lines, of course. But my goal here in explaining this concept of how to play the opening without knowing the opening is to not give our opponent more than we need to. And then we can get into a very playable middle game. So in this scenario, if we play e4 and our opponent plays d5, it looks like we should just take the bull by its horns and capture the pawn and let our opponent play catch-up. Let's take a quick look at a game where Bobby Fischer faced this opening against a Karl Robach in 1962. Okay, it's called the Scandinavian or the Scandinavian defense. There's a very instructive opening principle Fischer demonstrates here that we can learn. His opponent played queen takes d5, and the most common reply is knight to c3, attacking the queen, gaining a developmental tempo. But it does block the c-pawn, but White hopes to ride out this compensation for the rest of the game. The most common reply for Black is queen to a5, which will pin the knight when the d-pawn moves. But another common reply at that time was just moving the queen back to d8. But after Fischer dismantled this move, it's rarely seen, and queen to a5 is the most popular. White doesn't have to play knight to c3. He could play knight to f3, he could play d4. But for our purposes, either of those two moves have drawbacks, even though they are playable. As I've mentioned before, we want to avoid playing catch-up. If we play knight to f3, he can pin us right away. If we play d4, he can attack the pawn right away. Now it's 2 against 1, and again we're playing catch-up. It's your opponent applying pressure against you, and it's easier to make a mistake under those circumstances. So I say just avoid playing those lines and go down a simpler and clearer path. So let's go back to the moves that Black made in this game. Fischer attacked with knight to c3, and the queen ran all the way back. Fischer played d4. His opponent played g6. Bishop to f4, bishop to g7, and this is the part I want to show you. We've got two attackers on the pawn, right? You always ask, what is the threat? I've got 2 against 1. What do you do? What would you do? Pause the video. Okay, what did you come up with? Did you defend the pawn? That's not what Fischer did. He played queen to d2, continuing his development. Doesn't that allow Black to win this pawn? It does, but it's extremely dangerous to grab that pawn. Because notice, White has 2 pieces out, and Black only the bishop. That's 2 against 1, and that usually loses. Knight to f3 is very playable. It develops a piece, it doesn't violate any principles. But Fischer was looking to maintain his developmental advantage and go on an immediate attack, which is justifiable when you have an advantage in one of the elements, time, space, or force. This takes a high level of skill to allow your opponent to capture this pawn, because you'll need to know how to utilize your 2 against 1 advantage. You should calculate all the moves. But a top grandmaster wouldn't even have to. He will know he automatically has compensation for giving away this pawn. I mean, he will have to calculate the execution, but not to give up the pawn. When you capture something, you give up a tempo to do so, and your opponent's rebound can be fatal. In other videos, I explain how to always look at what is already being attacked. You can see that the bishop is attacking this pawn. I also discussed convergence on a square and coordinating your pieces or networking them, and you can easily see that this knight and bishop can coordinate on this c7 square. When you know what to look for, it doesn't take that much calculation. For example, if the queen takes, queen can capture, bishop takes, and you can immediately attack the bishop and the c7 pawn. Of course, we're giving up this pawn perhaps, but that greed may be dangerous for black. That bishop will be hanging. It'll be an undefended bishop. The rook can immediately attack it, or the knight can play knight takes c7 with check, hitting the rook. The king will have to run. Then we can move the rook. White will have 3 active pieces against just this bishop. And if we do it the other way, let's see what happens if the bishop takes. Bishop takes pawn. We could castle and have 2 attackers against the bishop. He'll be playing catch-up, maybe trying to defend it. If we go the other way, the knight can attack it, 2 against 1. Again, 3 pieces out against the lone bishop. You could even say 4 pieces out since this queen went all the way back to her starting position. In the end, you'll get your pawn back and so much more. His opponent didn't grab the pawn, but went on to develop and castle, and Fischer went on a kingside attack after he castled queenside and went on to win the game quickly. This is the only part I wanted to show you. If you want to look at the rest of that game, you can go to chessgames.com and look up Bobby Fischer versus Karl Robatsch, R-O-B-A-T-S-C-H. It's a fairly well-known game. So now let's look at the other gambit available to black if white plays e4, and that is f5. It's generally not a good idea to move your f pawns before you've castled, because it opens up diagonals to your king. And even after you've castled, this light square diagonal will be vulnerable. So what should we do? Should we capture the pawn? Should we advance? Lose a tempo? Should we defend the pawn, maybe with d3, not f3, for the reasons we mentioned earlier? We could defend with the knight and develop a piece. I'm actually finding this the most difficult to come up with a justification for making a move which seems better than the others without some drawbacks. When we looked at d4 c5, we saw how much we would be giving black if we captured the pawn, which is why we opted for d5. Here I only see us preventing the knight from coming to f6 if we play e5, but we have lost the tempo by moving the same piece twice. It's more difficult to determine if that's enough compensation. Capturing the wing pawn here isn't the same as capturing the wing pawn on the queen side, because the king side is much more vulnerable, so black doesn't gain as much from this capture. We do have this lovely check here with the queen, so if we capture the pawn, he won't be able to regain it back right away because of this check. For example, if he played, like if we did this and he did this, oh, that's curtains for him, right? This pawn is lovely here. He can't push, we'll take, win the rook, or just check him. His king's going to have to run and be exposed. We have to keep asking the question, what will we gain, what will we lose by making the moves we make? We could play d3, which opens up the dark squared bishop, but it blocks in the light squared bishop. I don't like allowing him to just capture here for the same reason as before. Stops our knight from coming out here right away. I don't like being a move behind unless I can clearly see the compensation. And quite often there is great compensation in a delayed recapture, which we'll get into at another time, but it has to be very clear. Developing the knight and defending, it's just too complicated for me. There's a lot of calculation here. He can take, we take, he can chase us. And for this reason, I'm going to reject knight to c3 as well. So let's back up. So it looks like we're left with capturing. If not for this check, I would consider the other moves more. This also keeps black from pushing the e-pawn right away. We could capture en passant, or just outright capture on e6. It stops g6. Never underestimate the power of gaining material. So black will be left with having to recapture this pawn. And in the meantime, we can develop our pieces. Yes, the fact that he can't recapture this pawn easily leans me in favor of capturing. We might be able to try to hang on to it. Okay, so let's leave it here. And in the next segment of how to play the opening without knowing the opening, we'll look at second and third move gambits and gambits created by white. I hope you got something out of this tedious analysis and that it was useful. Subscribe and thumbs up. It keeps me plugging away. Till next time, take care. Bye-bye.